In significant contrast with much of human history, our everyday lives are governed by a multitude of effective and equally applied laws. Regulations control food quality, building capacity, contracts which we enter into with others, the relationships we form with one another, and the manner in which these affect our society more broadly. Constitutional rights have increasingly become important legal and political issues, which see insertion through express inclusion in constitutional documents or via interpretation and expansion of broader terms and concepts. Owing to increased literacy and access to information, laws are communicated more effectively to the wider population, advertised ahead of enactment so that, for example, in response to the threat of laws on water charges in my home country, significant elements of the wider public could make clear their dissatisfaction.
We will not let them steal our water! We will not let them steal our resources!
However, this doesn't necessarily mean that the law is better understood today. When people discuss laws, they do so framed in the mindset of judgments, courts, and judges. The effects of this on the lawmaking process can now be seen in the Supreme Court of the United States and the public backlash that it is receiving as it revisits and overrules its own judgments. But these publicised decisions are not the origin of our laws. Public backlash against them is an ineffective method of affecting how our societies are run. Instead, if we want to protect our rights or amend our laws, we need to examine the professional, lawmaking bodies.
People like Tom Cruise visited Lowbridge, sadly.
Which govern us.
Fuck you, Deputy Stein.
And write our laws.
Mr. Zuckerberg, would you be comfortable sharing with us the name of the hotel you stayed in last night?
Legislatures. Human beings have formed lawmaking bodies and, by association, laws for millennia. These have taken many shapes, from socio-economically broad, participatory, locally formed and informal bodies, like the assemblies popularised by the Greek polis, to aristocratic advisory councils in countless empires and kingdoms. This series will examine the roles of these legislatures in the constitutions of different states. Oftentimes, constitutional discussion in popular media and academic literature can focus on the executive or the judiciary, the powers and the limitations placed on both. Instead, we will be honing in on where the grunt work of political debate occurs. We will be charting the development of multiple different legislatures through their early history into the modern period in order to understand and explain their contemporary importance in political discourse and constitutional structure. Beginning with the great father of the modern legislature, When the Angles, Saxons and Jutes arrived in the British Isles, overcoming native Brythonic populations and post-Roman political entities, they brought with them institutions based not on previous Roman inhabitants, but built upon fundamentally Germanic foundations. Arriving initially in warbands and settling into disparate communities, the Anglo-Saxon population relied upon consent to govern and raise military forces. As a result, an informal council formed around the figure of the king, which allowed him to gauge the opinion of subjects on different courses of action. This may have originally been members of the royal family and important nobles, but evolved over time to include figures from the church and broader representatives of the nobility. The powers of this assembly are not entirely clear, and it's likely that the lack of institutionalization means that the ability of this council to actively govern and legislate waxed and waned as kings relied upon them for support and cast them aside. When the Normans invaded, they replaced this Wheaton-agamot with the much more Latin and Kingish-sounding Curia Regis. Some historians view this as a weakening of the nobility around the king. In reality, it is likely that the Curia Regis is more clearly defined to us today, and therefore appears to hold less power than what came before. In the 1100s, the Curia Regis were often meeting 3 times a year, and were composed of the tenants-in-chief and the royal vassals who made up the upper end of the Norman baronage. By the 13th century, this council can begin to be seen as an early type of parliament. Successive experiments tied to the wars which challenged the monarchy throughout the medieval period resulted in greater representation on the council, and we see representatives of boroughs and shires begin to take their place. The council also splits at this point between the Great Council, who act as consultative advisors discussing policy, and the Small Council, confusingly also the Curia Regis, which consisted of bureaucrats, administrators, and judges, who take over the apparatus of running the kingdom as it centralises from Edward the Confessor onwards.
Two events crystallise the authority of Parliament in English constitutional law. The wacky years of the Cromwellian Civil Wars, wherein Parliament, specifically the House of Commons, would assert its authority over the King militarily, then judicially. And the Glorious Revolution, wherein the Parliament invited William of Orange to take the throne from James I to avoid those pesky Catholics and presbyters from getting uppity. These two events signal a shift in modernity, from Parliament as a body whose consent was vital to the King for financial reasons, to Parliament as an independent decision-making body whose actions could be directly fatal to the monarch. Fast forwarding through many years of history that I'm not qualified to tell you about, the House of Commons would extend its franchise to men throughout the 1800s and then, shockingly, women from 1918 to 1928. The lower house would assert its supremacy over the House of Lords during the resolution of the Irish question through the Parliament Act 1911, removing its unlimited veto power and reducing it to a consultative and interlocutory body. The House of Commons, as a democratically elected legislature, would then emerge as the principal element of the legislature of the United Kingdom from the 1900s through to the present day. The Parliament of the United Kingdom today consists of two houses, Lords and Commons, alongside the nominal role played by the Sovereign, the Queen. The House of Lords, both spiritual and temporal, consists of 26 ecclesiastical peers, 92 hereditary peers, and almost 700 life peers. Life peers are appointed by the Queen, hereditary peers inherit their office, while ecclesiastical peers retain membership ex officio. The Lords once made up a significant element of the legislature. Constitutional reforms of the Lords from the late 19th and early 20th centuries would see it become more of an advocacy body of politicians who are not expected to actually legislate, but rather deliberate and discuss. Full reform of the House of Lords was repeatedly attempted in the 1900s and 2000s in order to democratise or fully remove the hereditary element. However, apart from a reduction in hereditary peers and the establishment of a commission to advise the Queen on appointments, full reform of the House of Lords remains ephemeral. The House of Commons consists of 650 members who are elected in a first-past-the-post system of voting, which returns members of Parliament for individual voting districts. The Commons makes up the most significant and active aspect of Parliament. Government cabinets are formed almost exclusively from members of Commons, and the significant portfolios of cabinet are today never held by Lords. If you want to be a Prime Minister, a Chancellor of the Exchequer, or a Minister of any significant department, you must first be elected. The office of Speaker exists in both houses, a role which involves regulating the debate in both chambers and offering a public figurehead, advocate and representative for the chamber itself and its members.
Can I just apologise for having to interrupt the Prime Minister? Mr Boswell, calm yourself. You've got to try to learn to behave in a statesmanlike fashion. That's your long-term goal. It may be very long-term, but it should be a goal.
Political parties dominate both houses of Parliament. While there are non-partisan Lords, for example Lord Spiritual, the majority of Lords who debate bills and vote belong to a political party. As a result, the scope for true independence in questioning the government, voting on bills and debating legislation is limited. Nonetheless, members of Commons in the United Kingdom compose the most directly electable and publicly visible element of the UK government. Owing to its monopoly on legislating, much of the highbrow decision-making of the state is made in Parliament. In particular, budgets are controlled from within the House of Commons and allocate the resources of state. Governments can also be collapsed in the Commons through the passage of a vote of no confidence. As a result, it is almost a necessity for governing parties to command a majority in the House, be that through coalition or single-party rule. Without this majority, the governing party faces constant instability and threat from the opposition. While adjacent legislatures have toyed with the confidence and supply agreements which have facilitated minority governments, in practice the first-past-the-post system and electoral politics of the UK have traditionally favoured strong majorities in government. Without such majorities, the potential for general elections remains on a knife edge. Parliament is also responsible for agreeing to international and bilateral treaties. Its sole legislative authority prohibits a government from agreeing to one in its place. This placed the various treaties amending the European Union into public scrutiny, which perhaps contributed to the ultimate departure of the UK from the EU. The Parliament of the UK also engages in the recognition of subordinate legislatures, in a process known as devolution. This was originally a practice adopted in Northern Ireland in an attempt to distance Westminster from the issues of governing the province, and to allow greater autonomy for the political actors there, making Unionists believe they were safe from a knife in the back from Westminster, and Republicans believe in eventual democratic reunification. Devolution spread to the other major UK nations, Scotland and Wales, and as a result all three provinces retain a nominal ability to control diverse policy areas.
Scotland's NHS, for example, was cleft apart from the UK and is generally seen to perform better. Language Acts have passed in the various parliaments, resulting in revived interest in Welsh and Gaelic, while Northern Ireland represents an obvious exception to this. Scotland's Assembly at Holyrood is the most independent of the three regional bodies, with its control over its own legal system and law code tying into this. The Welsh Assembly, Senedd Cymru, retains power over taxation and some areas of public expenditure and law, but has less power owing to its inclusion in the English legal system. The Northern Irish Legislature is modelled on a power-sharing cross-community agreement, intending to involve both communities in the north, but in reality leading to significant instability and periods of direct rule from Britain, all while retaining its own legal system, which takes elements of surrounding jurisdictions. The scope of devolution, as with much British legislative detail, remains to be fully understood. In particular, the passage of post-Brexit legislation, such as the UK Internal Markets Act, seems to suggest that Westminster will be attempting to limit the ability of regional assemblies to defy Acts of Parliament. Early English medieval history is a demonstration in why absolutism is an ideal monarchs aspire to, not one that they begin with. The governance of the United Kingdom through Parliament, as outlined above, is the story of a tug of war. The constant transfer of political power between the sovereign and the important military and financial players in the kingdom. This begins all the way in the Witenagemot and continues to evolve and develop through to the beginning of modernity. The confidence of the advisors and notables around the king became a prerequisite to govern. Where kings, for political or religious reasons, lost the respect and confidence of Parliament, they were ejected from power. As the preeminence of the Lords waned in the coming of modernity with the decline of the baronage, and as the House of Commons opened up its voting constituents beyond those well-to-do men able to afford the right, the confidence of the Commons gradually became a byword for democratic legitimacy. Negotiation, then, might be the best term to describe the United Kingdom constitution more broadly, and the position of Parliament therein. The legislature of the United Kingdom has engaged in a series of negotiations and renegotiations with the sovereign, both legal and violent, aiming to expand their power, which have culminated in the unparalleled power which the Parliament of the United Kingdom holds today. That we now see this same attempted renegotiation taking place with the subordinate parliaments of the provinces is a sort of great irony for those looking on. Internally, the manner in which the Parliament functions is a continuation of this constant negotiation. Prime Ministers and party whips make deals, and opposition leaders tempt government MPs to defect in a constant attempt at strengthening or weakening the governing party. This is the reason why we're looking at England as the first legislature to be examined in this series. It is tempting when looking at jurisdictions with written constitutions to view rules and doctrines as insurmountable and concrete barriers. The story of Parliament teaches us not to place too much emphasis or faith in written rules. The constitutional position of an organ of the state, such as a legislature, is one which is changeable, should the political actors involved be willing to work to hash out new roles and realities for themselves.